Hello, boys and girls. Thank you very much for joining with me as we continue in this mystery story of Jotham's journey to Christmas. And we're in week 2 of Advent, and this is day 4, chapter 4, called Consequences. Jotham's heart stopped. His mouth went dry. His knees began to shake, and he felt all the blood drain from his head. Decca of Megiddo sat at the table, staring at Jotham and his companions, picking his teeth with his knife. He smiled, but it was not the smile of a friend glad to see a long-lost companion. In the smile, it was the smile of one who enjoyed killing and was about to do so again. The other 3 men were still talking. Finally, Nathan noticed the look on Jotham's face. He looked toward the door then. He, too, felt the blood drain from his head. A moment later, the other 2 men noticed, and they recognized Decca. They didn't know about the trouble Jotham and Nathan had barely lived through, but they did know that Decca was an evil man and that any room he was in was not a safe room. "So," said Decca, drawing it out so that it struck the group like a bullwhip, "the fool is no fool and tries to make a fool of Decca of Megiddo." Nathan set his jaw and drew his shoulders up straight but said nothing. Jotham's knees shook even harder as Decca turned toward him. "I have followed you far, little one," Decca said as he stared at Jotham. "I thought I had lost you forever, but then in you walk like a lamb for the slaughter." He threw his head back and laughed, and it sounded to Jotham like the roar of a lion and the laugh of a hyena put together. Silas the merchant and Hashra of Bethlehem stepped up beside Nathan, ready to join him in whatever was to come. As Decca's attention was on Jotham, Nathan whispered, "Hazra, when the fighting starts, take Jotham and run." "Friend, you are outnumbered. I cannot leave you to fight alone." Hazra was right, of course. Decca had 4 tall men with him, each with muscles that looked to Jotham like the trunk of trees, and swords that were longer than Jotham was tall. "No," Nathan hissed. "Save the boy. There's a priest, Zechariah, who lives in the hills to the north. Take the boy there. He will be safe." Hazra didn't like the idea of leaving his friends to fight 5 bigger men, but he knew he must honor Nathan's wishes. "Very well," he whispered. "I shall take care of the boy. Jehovah God be with you." Suddenly Decca turned his attention to Nathan. "And you, fool!" He spat the word out, drawing his curved sword. "It is you who stole my prize, and for that you must die." Decca's sword sliced right through the air directly at Nathan's stomach, but Nathan jumped aside. Grabbing a chair, he swung at Decca's arm, knocking the sword from his hand. Silas, too, took up a chair just as Decca's 4 men jumped up and drew their own swords. In that same moment, Hazra swept Jotham into his arms and headed for the back of the inn, calling on the innkeeper to help his friends. Jotham kicked and screamed at Hazra to let him go to help Nathan, but Hazra held him tightly. Decca screamed in pain and in anger. He picked up his sword and began hacking at the chair that Nathan held up in defense. The other 4 men surrounded Silas, blocking Jotham's view. In a moment that was burned into Jotham's memory forever, he watched as 2 of the men drew their swords. A moment later, Silas fell to the ground in a heap and didn't move. Jotham screamed and watched the 4 men surround Nathan, just as he and Hazra slammed through the door and out into the night. Nathan looked Jotham square in the eye and mouthed one word. "Shalom," he said, which means peace. Then the door slammed shut, just as a long curved sword sliced through the air directly in line with Nathan's neck. Everything went black as Hazra carried Jotham into the night, with Jotham still screaming. "Quiet, I bid you, young one," whispered Hazra. "These streets are not friendly in the night." They ran to the back of Silas's house, where Hazra's camel was tethered. Quickly they untied and mounted the camel. With 2 clicks of his tongue and a jab in the ribs and his heels, Hazra spurred the animal to full speed. Down the streets of Jericho they raced, and out into the black desert night. Jotham clutched Hazra with all his strength as he sobbed into the back of Hazra's tunic. "Peace, my son," Hazra called back. "The angels of Jehovah God are with our friends." Just outside Jericho, Hazra left the road and shot straight up into the hills. The moon had not yet risen, and all Jotham could see was blackness. He couldn't even see the ground under the camel's feet. "How can you see where you're going?" Jotham cried, afraid of being thrown to the ground, and his grief was overwhelmed by the fear of falling. "Fear not, my friend," Hazra answered over the pounding of camel hooves. "In my younger days, my friends and I raided the Roman camps outside Jericho here. I had navigated these back trails on many a dark night." Jotham's bottom was getting sore from all the bouncing by the time Hazra finally slowed the camel to a walk. The camel heaved huge breaths. Jotham thought it smelled a lot like a particular meal his mother made, a meal that caused even the sheep to run away. "I believe we are safe now," Hazra said. They climbed far into the hills, were now on top of a plateau. The wind blew hard here, and would cover up their tracks the moment they were made. As they traveled on, Jotham began to breathe easier and his heart slowed down a little bit. That's when the grief fully struck him, and he began to cry once more. "I killed them," he cried. "I killed them both." Hazra stopped the camel and lifted Jotham to the ground, shielding him from the wind and sand. "Jotham, Jotham, what are you saying? You have killed no one. It was Decca, that beast." Hazra spit on the ground after speaking the name of Decca. "May Jehovah God reward him richly for this deed." "No, it was me," Jotham cried. "Don't you see? If it weren't for me, Nathan and Silas would still be alive." Hazra hugged Jotham close. "Here now, boy, you must not believe such things. Decca alone is responsible for this evil." Jotham didn't say anything, but deep in his heart, he knew that all of this started the morning he had disobeyed his father. After a few minutes, Hazra lifted Jotham back onto the camel, and together they rode through the night. It was just before dawn when they approached a small group of clay houses with a well in front. As they approached, a tall, thin man with long gray hair came from one house, holding a lamp up in front of him. Through sleepy eyes, Jotham saw that he looked almost as old as Moses himself. "Who is that?" the man shouted. "Who's there?" "Shalom, friend," Hazra shouted back. "It's a weary traveler and a small boy. We seek refuge from marauders." "Do I know this one who calls me friend?" "No, you do not, but we are sent by Nathan of Qumran. Would you be the priest Zechariah?" "I would indeed. And if you be sent of Nathan, you truly are my friend. Come now, tell me of marauders." Quickly they all went inside the house, where Zechariah's wife Elizabeth was waiting in her nightclothes. Hazra gently set Jotham down at a table, where he was instantly asleep. After a few minutes later, Hazra explained all about Silas, Nathan, and the boy. "What is Decca doing this far south?" Zechariah asked no one in particular. Then he looked at Jotham with compassion. "Of course, we'll be glad to hide the boy here until his family can be found." Hazra gently shook Jotham awake. "Jotham," he said, "this is Zechariah. He is the priest, and he'll take care of you for a few days. I must return to my inn at Bethlehem, but I shall keep my eyes searching for your family." Jotham nodded. He had met so many people since leaving his family that he didn't think he had any more friendship to give. And now here was one more he had to be a part of, he had to part from. But he hugged Hazra tightly, then greeted Zechariah politely. "And this is my little family," Zechariah said proudly. Jotham was amused when the old man pointed to an equally old woman who was holding a brand new baby. "This is my wife Elizabeth," he said, "and this is my new son. His name is John." So Jotham began another night away from his family and another night with strangers. As he looked out the window from his makeshift bed, he stared at the stars and thought about Nathan and about the terrible consequences of his disobedience. He looked at his mother's star once more, the one that shined brighter than any other, and wondered if anything would ever be the same again. Throughout the Bible, we read story after story about the terrible consequences of sin. Adam and Eve were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, the entire world destroyed by a flood. David committed adultery, and the son born to him died because of it. Sin has consequences, sometimes even after we're forgiven. Jotham is sad today, sad at losing Nathan and Silas, and sad that he is partly to blame. It's much more fun to think of happy things during Advent, but we must remember that the world Jesus entered was and is still a harsh and evil world. Learning that there are consequences for our sin is not very pleasant. Like Jotham, we sometimes don't understand this until we have done something that hurts someone else terribly. But then, that was exactly why Jesus came to earth, to bring us forgiveness for our disobedience, and to teach us how to love each other, how to forgive each other, and how to obey those in authority over us. Yes, Christmas is a happy time, but it's happy because God loved us enough to save us from our own selfishness. He came to show us that even when we must suffer the consequences of our actions, there is still hope and forgiveness through Jesus.